Yes, I would like to start.
Thank you.
Welcome. First, I'd like to welcome Shailesh Shirali in Pine Cottage. He was happy to give us the honor to discuss with us one of the texts in Krishnamurti's book, A Flame of Learning. My name is Jaap Sluijter. I'm the director of the Krishnamurti Center, and Shailesh is already for 10 years the director of the Krishnamurti Educational Center in
Sahyadri
in Pune. And he has been teaching mathematics for many years in Rishi Valley, from 1984 to almost, I guess about 2012 or something.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Has written books about mathematics, has been the head of school in Rishi Valley also for several years. So he's very familiar with Krishnamurti's work on education and has worked in the schools. And I think that's a really good mix between having the theoretical experience and the real lived experience of being in a Krishnamurti school. So there are many angles I could start with, but I would like first to do a little preamble.
Sure.
Because there are we're looking at the chapter that is published in the book, The Flame of Learning. It's the first chapter, and we both have read the chapter, and we both have, I have listened to the talk also, and I've listened to it several times. And there are certain things that are being said that are specific to Krishnamurti schools, but I would like to somehow look at it also that it has a wider application, it has wider significance, let me put it that way. That actually when we talk about education, if we talk about the human being developing its full potential in a school or outside, that it's not, so what Krishnamurti is talking about, he is talking specifically about developing that in the school, but I think it is as relevant as to schools and to places, educational places outside of schools.
Sure.
So I would like to not just only focus on in its applicability on the Krishnamurti schools. So that's so I would like to stay with the wide angle, at least for a certain bit.
Okay.
So then the chapter, the discussion that Krishnamurti had in 1976, September 9th, has many layers to it, in my understanding, and that's what I want to bring out with you further. On the one hand, there's a content, responsibility, freedom, authority, and we can go into that. But the amount of content is very minimal, I would say. If you look at the teachings, if you could summarize it maybe in one paragraph, a 1.5 hour discussion. But I would suggest that in this discussion that Krishnamurti had with the staff in Brockwood, that he was somehow taking them to a process of, as a group, becoming clear about what it means to educate and to be an educator. You could even say it's wider than that. It's how to be a full human being, because it's applicable equally to that. So the bulk of the conversation that Krishnamurti had was all asking questions to the staff. So what are you doing? What are you doing in the class? What are you doing with the students? And it was not, these are the teachings and can you implement it? It was really that he wanted to bring the staff to that, facing the questions themselves, and,
right.
And from there, I would just like to hear from you where you're at with this. You hear me, how you feel when you hear me saying all these things. Yeah.
Yes, I think he has articulated a very fundamental problem, which is part of the schooling process, which is the culture of the body of teachers and how teachers communicate among one another. How do they inquire into what teaching is all about, what education is all about, what kind of questions they hold. And if a new teacher were to enter the school, what would be the response of the existing teachers to that new teacher? And which is a way actually of examining one's own ideas, one's own prejudices, and the way one looks at education and so on. So I would say that he is focusing in a way on the culture of relationship among the teachers themselves. He would probably have said that is one of the most important things in a school, the culture of learning, the culture of inquiring together, the culture of questioning one another, the culture of questioning deeply held ideas and assumptions, and how we help each other to do that. He is always focusing on if one person has understood something a little more deeply, can he or she help the others, not help in the usual sense of the word, but be a part of that inquiry and not just be isolated centers, each one just inquiring on their own. So that seems to be a very central thing in that particular conversation. The culture of inquiry, the culture of exchange and dialogue within the teacher body. And I think that is probably one of the most difficult things to establish in a school. It's very easy to go into a class and establish relationship with your own set of students, not only your particular subject area, but deeper than that. But this other quality that he's talking about seems to be a very elusive one. From my own experience, it is one of the hardest things to get going. This learning from one another. Because ideas are very strong. Everyone has very strong ideas how this should happen and how that should happen, and we are not easily prepared to give them up.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize that a little bit, or bring that out a bit more. So he really talks about that as almost a communal effort, right?
Yes.
As far as the teachers, which is somehow different from looking at education of a teacher going into a classroom and it's the teacher with the students. It's somehow the body of the teachers, the body of the group of teachers with the students. And he says that how that body of students how they are interacting and how are they developing seems to be a very fundamental aspect of education.
Yes.
And you rightly say so, it's very difficult, right? It's very difficult to bring that about. So in your experience, or if you look at the text, but also in your experience, why is that difficult? What will you say are the kind of impediments that are there for a group of people? And of course, I also have my idea, but I just like maybe to verbalize that out. How do you, with a group of people, to bring out what is really the impediments, or what are really each other's limitations, or where we are growing different, or our insecurities, or our biases, without and what would your approach be in that? So first of all, how do you bring that climate? How do you bring out that climate of learning together as a group?
Well, that is putting your finger straight on the really hard problem, you can say, about teaching, about education. Because you see, different people come with different kinds of conditioning, different kinds of baggage. If you have people who have been in education for a little while, who have already had some experience of teaching, they come with some very definite ideas about teaching, of how children should be approached, what kind of conversation you should have, what kind of communication if there's a problem of discipline or whatever. They may have ideologies also about freedom and so on. So to break through that is not easy, because either there is a patronizing attitude to the person who is talking to you, the person from the administration maybe. That may be one kind of problem. And then there's the very young person who comes in, who quite often has a certain attitude towards authority. It may not necessarily be anti-authority, but they would rather keep authority at some distance and not immediately be seen as getting very close to authority and all the time listening to them. So typically the younger ones form a little group on their own. So these are all real, you can say, sociological issues of a campus life. And to be able to communicate that you genuinely are interested in inquiring and not in proving somebody wrong, I think that's quite a tough thing. That is the real challenge. Yes.
Yeah, you call it, it's like a group dynamics, right? Like
yes.
And it's not only because of the limitations of the individual, but as groups we have evolved somehow to act in a certain way of how we virtue signal or give all our signals, social signals off, and how to behave. Now, I can see a challenge there. So on one hand, you would say, if you normally, if you say, as a teacher, fear is an important aspect, right? It's for everybody, every human being, fear is a very important aspect. It's fear on how we're being seen, fear for our colleagues, fear for our job, fear for the students, fear to perform well so your students do well. So there's an endless sequence of things that we are afraid of, which are very difficult to talk about, because I don't dare to say to you that I'm afraid. Because if I would say to you that I'm afraid, I would weaken my position. I would maybe even portray myself as a weak teacher who could then be in the next round of rehiring, not being rehired. So how do you engage with a group on the very fact that we're all scared, that we're all in this myriad of different fears and anxieties, and at the same time, not making it therapeutical in the sense from I'm gonna help Shailesh to overcome his anxiety. Not that I'm against that, but I'm just saying so how do you create an atmosphere that's not the personal becomes very important, but that it's almost like the collective, the collective consciousness. We as humans are afraid. Can we look at it from that perspective instead of Shailesh is afraid for a challenging mathematical question and Jaap is afraid for something else, whatever. So how do you move that? How do you create a climate that can really do something on that level without falling into all kinds of traps that have its own limitations?
My own observation there is that the vehicle which works best there is to have study group meetings. And perhaps many of our schools have that. But it's very important that we have these little meetings of maybe 10 to 12 people at a time for as long as is feasible within the timetable, where you're not just talking about matters of discipline or how to teach this or how to teach that or how to settle the timetable and so on, but actually talk about such matters where it becomes apparent that we are willing to be seen as vulnerable. We are willing to talk about things that we find difficult, things that we have not resolved for ourselves. So we don't all the time come across as people who have already worked out everything and have no questions left to answer. I think that communication is very important. And whenever something has happened, from my own observation, it has happened as a result of that teachers have seen that there are people who are actually asking these questions, who are not just pretending, they're actually asking these questions. It's not just a communication trick. And that vulnerability is very important, because you see, there's another challenge which we face, particularly in our schools. It may be slightly less here in the Oak Grove setting or the Brockwood setting. But there are many teachers who join the schools who have almost no idea of the philosophic background of these schools. They may have just heard the name and that's about all. So you are caught in a process of trying to explain. And that immediately creates its own dynamic, that you have to try to explain what the teachings are about, explain what this school is all about. So even before you get into the process of inquiring into something on a somewhat like an equal footing, you first have to get over this initial barrier of explanation and a little bit of exposition. That I personally find to be quite a challenge, because how you have to get over that as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you will be in it forever, all the time explaining and just caught in exposition. And then to reach a stage when you are actually inquiring together. But I would say that is the only time. It usually happens sometime a few months after the year begins. When you begin to see that people are asking questions of that kind, and they are seeing that there is a genuine atmosphere of inquiry in those settings.
So you said in the beginning, you said that creating that kind of climate, so these studies groups, to create that kind of climate where there's that kind of vulnerability and maybe authenticity.
Right.
How? So you're saying that's a very challenging thing to do, right? So
Yes.
One challenge you said is, hey, not everybody comes and is already very informed with Krishnamurti's work.
Yeah.
But are there other challenges, like Krishnamurti in this discussion? He in the Flame of Learning in the book he talks about already teachers who are very inspired, right? He states that already in the beginning, so he skips over this particular issue that you're mentioning. So when you have established that, what are the other issues that you think would be good to bring out? What are the other challenges for creating that kind of exploration?
The other challenge is that I would say it is experienced during that initial phase itself, that you meet established ideas which are already quite strong. They may come from some existing religious inclinations. For example, in India, they may already have some inclination towards some Hindu philosophy or something, or some disciplinarian kind of ideas. Or sometimes it is the opposite, the extreme freedom to do anything is allowed. Don't try to curtail anything. So you have to meet all these various competing philosophies, and to do it without getting into confrontation, I would say, is the tough part, because it means looking at one's own ideas critically. And often you find that in these meetings, people are trying to explain their own ideas. And to be able to step away and say, we are not here to discuss the good and bad of any particular ideology, but to be able to understand why we hang on to, why we are attracted to these ideologies at all. So that is itself a major shift in, you can say a paradigm shift, that we are not here to examine the good and bad of any particular way of looking at education, or that is it's a sudden turn which takes a while to reach.
Yeah. So so in that chapter, in that discussion, Krishnamurti talks about by exploring this, they're writing a book, right? I think he calls
Right,
it the Book
right.
of Intelligence or something.
That's right.
How to be intelligent. We're writing the book How to be Intelligent, and later on it was called the book The Flame of Learning. But there was some interesting aspect there which I just like to bring out with you in that. Because he says at a certain point, so for those people who are familiar with Krishnamurti's teachings, they know there's nothing you can do mechanical. You cannot set a process up. You cannot make a system to come to understanding. But actually in this particular book, he says, well, the rational about it, he calls it the rational, is actually mechanical, and we need to work it out. And I feel what you've just been expressing are some of these things that are the rational, right? If you come with
Right.
preconceived ideas, or if you come uninformed, or you're not educated about Krishnamurti's teachings, or so there's a series of things that are already like mechanical components that you can give a place. Okay, so how are you going to work with that? So are there any? But I found it a very surprising thing of Krishnamurti to say there's a mechanical component to this rationality. Are there any other elements that you can think of that could be, if you have, because he didn't develop it, he didn't develop the rational any further, or maybe a little bit. We can go into that later. But were there any things that for you stand out from your practical view also? Because I feel that's really important.
Yes, most of it, in fact, falls into that kind of a description that much of our exchange is of this kind, where a certain base is assumed and is left unquestioned, and leaving that base untouched, then we argue about some matters. So sort of a lot of assumptions are left completely unexamined. They are there. And taking those as givens, then you set about arguing this or that. And we don't actually we don't seem to penetrate beyond that. So it's as if you assume certain things are fixed. You may assume that the structure of school is fixed, and then how best to do this or that. So there's a lot of, that is the initial obstacle, I would say, to understand this, that there is this huge body of assumptions which are there underneath the surface. So this is it's a huge barrier, I would say. There are so many, in fact, as Krishnamurti has pointed out, that the way we all regard our own philosophies or our own opinions as something unique to us, that we have developed them. And it's our special idea or contribution to life. And we don't see how much we have taken or borrowed from things around us, and how we have just internalized opinions from 101 sources, writers whom we have read, and philosophers and whoever.
But if you're in daily life, when you have a hidden layer, you normally would say, well, we get an outside therapist in, psychoanalyst, you know what I mean, to bring out the hidden layers. Now, it looks like, but you normally would have somebody from the outside. Now, so what I'm trying to say is the challenge to do that with people you work with, people who you are triggered with, people you are disagreed on philosophical issues. It's quite a daunting task, I might say.
It's very daunting, I would say. And it's daunting in a variety of ways. It can be daunting when people come with strong ideas already formed because of exposure to various educational philosophies. It can be daunting if they come from strong religious background. And ironically, it can also be daunting if they have formed strong ideas about Krishnamurti, which is another very complicated situation. When you have studied Krishnamurti and you have already formed a whole lot of conclusions based on that study, those can be in some ways the most difficult of all. Because because then, they may say, oh, this is the way, this is what Krishnamurti actually meant. And, then it becomes an impossible barrier, really.
Good. So this is really good. I really like hearing this, because I think this is really shows for people who are new to this, especially, that the kind of issues that when you enter an educational environment, and I deliberately formulate that more widely, are more than just, understanding the teachings first and then go in. In the end, of course, I think in summary, what you're saying is we all have to understand ourselves first before we can explore it again. So now to bring it back to the book, there's one particular issue which is related again, because everything is related in the end. Krishnamurti says, one of the first things is, can the teacher come off the pedestal in his relationship with the students? Where he says, can there be a relationship with no authority? Mm-hmm. Now, I can imagine that can be misunderstood also, like we do what we like. So how do you see that balance between coming off the pedestal? How do you see what that means? And how do you see that balance with, you do what you like?
Yes, that's a very subtle point. And it again gets interpreted in a variety of ways. So coming off the pedestal could mean that we just address each other on a first name basis. We put our arms around each other, that kind of thing. But it doesn't seem to may not go beyond that. But I would say the most important part of that is to be able to question each other and not regard questions as impertinent or things which we are not supposed to talk about. That is, if a student asks something, to actually take it seriously, even if you may consider it to lead nowhere, to actually take it seriously and to be able to demonstrate that whatever, if there's a flaw in that way of looking, to actually go down that path. To me, the essence, there's so many aspects of this whole thing of getting off the pedestal. I would say one is to take seriously what a child says to you, and to take the trouble to walk down the path with him or her and demonstrate what actually it implies, what it leads to. Then the more subtler aspects, which he has also pointed out, which perhaps many places we don't realize, the authority of forming a group around yourself. That's a very subtle point. This becoming popular and becoming like a center of popularity, So it becomes like a negative way of establishing authority. In the name of non-authority, you end up becoming an authority. That is a very subtle point, and I think perhaps it can be a difficult lesson to learn for most teachers, because their initial response to non-authority is exactly that, to try to become popular and not realize that itself contains its own trap of authority. I think that is quite a difficult lesson for us to understand.
But I can imagine, of course, it's really a challenge for a teacher. And I have been teaching for 5 years in Brockwood, and before that at university. But because when you're popular, you have power, you have security. When you're popular, it means that you have people who support you. You have your evolutionary group who supports you. As a group of monkeys, we had.
That's right.
So how do you? Is there anything particular? Can you say anything? How you address that, or how you have seen that being addressed? How do you engage with that?
Oh yes. One of the commonest ways is you find that teachers who it happens very often. First of all, very very often. And it tends to happen more at certain certain ages than others. You'll find it most often happens when for children who are in the age of, say, 10, 11, 12, and the teachers who are close to them. It generally does not happen to older children, nor to the very young children, but usually the middle group, the teachers who are close to them. And I would say the first sign that things are going in that direction is when the teacher begins to lose perspective. You'll find the teacher beginning to defend a student or defend a group of students or try to represent them in a sort of lobby for them. And then you have to then engage the teacher in conversation and point out that this is happening, that it means that you are beginning to identify with them or they with you together. And identification itself is a way of losing perspective. There is an element of power, of authority in it. The key thing is identification.
And have you seen that people can grow through that? Can you grow through a phase where you feel so good when you have that admiration or people, a group of students like you, and you advocate for them? And can you do you see that successful growing, that people learn? Oh my God, I realize now what I'm doing, that I'm actually dependent on their applause.
I think it can happen. It can happen in the difficult way. One learns through pain. One learns by finding out that one's judgment went wrong, that we are actually beginning to support something which perhaps should not be supported. I think growth can happen, but it can be a bit painful.
Yeah.
It can be a bit hurtful. And I think it depends a lot on the self-reflectiveness, awareness of the teacher. Otherwise, you may end up becoming a bit bitter through the process, which can also happen.
Yeah.
But there is a possibility. I've seen that happen also.
So then the next bit that Krishnamurti says, after you've come off the pedestal, he says, after you've come off the pedestal, then what? The first thing, and that's what you went into actually already very nicely, I felt, is that you establish a relationship, right? The relationship is, you aim to try to establish what he called the right kind of relationship, where, as we just said, when students become dependent on you, there's an issue. But if students ask questions to you, can you meet them at their level? Not only questions, but also their concerns, their emotionality, the whole being in that sense. And then so then he said right relationship, and then he extends that in this book to relationship, freedom, and responsibility. He almost uses these three words in the same group.
Right.
In the remainder of the book. How can freedom be related to that? How do you see that? And then responsibility, freedom and responsibility, because it sounds almost like if you're responsible, you're not free. It has these contradictions in it, apparent contradictions.
Yes, I would say that is one of the most challenging notions in any school, to really go into the question of freedom, because the immediate connotation of that word is the exact opposite of what we have in mind. Typically, for example, I have seen that happen in my own school, where children will say, there is no freedom in this school. We are being told there is a dress code, we are being told what to do, this, that, whatever. A lot of complaints are there. And then to actually point out that freedom means something very much more than that, and to actually be able to penetrate that initial barrier of cynicism or reaction. I think this is a very difficult area. It's a difficult area even for teachers to understand that freedom refers to the freedom within oneself and not freedom that is given to you. Because I think this is one of the strongest conditionings. For example, in India, we have the freedom movement. The country got political freedom some years back. So everything is geared towards that kind of a meaning of freedom, that freedom is something given to you by somebody. An organization or somebody gives it to you. And this notion that there is a freedom which is inward, which is in which you are not driven by things of which you have no understanding. You're driven in a direction and you do not know why you're being driven in that direction. That notion, I find, is something which most of us seem to have a great barrier, great difficulty in understanding.
You mean like...
I think it's an area which I would say we have not made very good progress in our schools.
Would you say it's like freedom from compulsion or freedom from like and dislike? Would you put it in those wordings?
Yes, freedom from having strong opinions about something. Freedom from saying, this is what I want. This is the lifestyle I would like to lead. This is what I want. This is how I think. So you have various compulsions which are pushing you in certain direction. And you assume that is you. That I having formed certain opinions, I don't need to go beyond that. I define myself in a certain way, and there is no need for me to explain that. That itself is like a ground zero. There's no need to go below that. I think that's a very extremely strong conditioning in us. By saying that I want to go in this particular direction, and that's it. That cannot be questioned.
Yeah, so that's maybe the last bit is maybe, I just want to add something, because I don't think you're saying you shouldn't, it's wrong to have those kind of feelings, because we all are driven by our beliefs, what we momentarily think.
That's right.
But somehow you're saying, is there space around it to question or to look? Right?
That's right. To be able to question why we want certain things, so that we are aware of our own drives. Yes, not to say that we should not think that way. We should not want something, but to be aware of those drives. For example, a very strong desire for success, or very strong desire to achieve a certain position in some organization. It may just be there, like it's been planted in us, and a very deep desire as a result of our whole childhood comparison, perhaps. We are driven in particular ways. We may be carrying some deep fears within us. We don't know. There are all kinds of reasons which push us in particular directions, and unless we are very self-aware, we are very watchful in our moments of action, what makes us go in particular directions. We just assume that drive is not to be questioned. I think that's the error. It's not that one must not have the drive. In fact, drive is a very basic, as you said, it's a very basic instinct in life. But to not be aware that there could be a background to a drive.
Yeah. So to clarify that a little
Yes.
bit, you're saying also it's not something like defining a new morality.
Yes.
It's not a morality what is right and wrong. You should not have this or this. So it's also not about policing strong urges for success or strong urges to do whatever,
That's right.
So because the human mind, as it currently is, will try to translate those kind of concepts in a certain way. So the tendency of trying to police or manage it, I was just thinking, okay, come off the pedestal. I can give them some new teacher some paragraphs of what it means to come off the pedestal. But it can, what I'm thinking, what you're trying to say, is not okay, it's going to be a kind of concept that I'm going to apply within myself, or something that I'm creating an idea what it is to be without pedestal, or what it means to be off the pedestal, and then having a kind of check mark. If I'm off the pedestal, I'm doing this, that, and that, and that. You see, because that's a very subtle thing, because I think our human minds are such that we want to translate it to doable things that I can defend. I am off the pedestal in your school because I'm doing A, B, C, and D. But that's not what you're aiming for.
That's quite right.
Yeah.
Also, the other point about drives. Again, a practical difficulty that we face is that you don't always reach a situation where you're able to question something in a natural way, to find the space to do so. For example, in India, well, that's for all the Krishnamurti schools, we are vegetarian. But a child may have this urge to have non-vegetarian food. So what happens to that urge? So it's very easy for our schools to be seen as puritanical places where we just suppress certain urges. People want to have non-vegetarian food, but we don't permit them. They want to be competitive, but we won't permit them to be. So this is a very difficult area because the actual pace of activity of the school, momentum of activity, is such that you don't always have the time, the leisure. That's, I think, the actual meaning of the word leisure as Krishnamurti uses it, to be able to examine this drive. So it gets translated as don't do it. And that is what sets up the reaction. Then naturally the child is going to see the environment as controlling, as puritanical, as just blocking the drive that I have. I would say this is a real practical difficulty of a Krishnamurti school.
Yes.
That we just don't have the time
leisure
to be able to go into every single drive in that manner.
So, I mean, I could open that up a bit further. I could say, so what, because this is what I'm seeing not only in a Krishnamurti school, but all schools.
Yes.
The admin is becoming the testing, the kind of education, the amount of money that's involved, that it's very difficult to create that leisure. I'm just saying, is it a dead-end road? Should one revisit the whole schooling so there is leisure? I'm just trying to facetiously bring that in put some contrast around. How do you look at that? Should we revisit all this so there is leisure?
Well, practically speaking, it may not be possible to just redo the whole schooling system, but if we understand the vital need to at least to have some taste of that experience, I think that is perhaps more important than to be able to do it for everything.
Yeah.
Because it may be practically impossible to do it for every single occasion. But to be able to take one thing and to go into it deeply and understand that there is such a thing as a background to a drive, and it doesn't have to be taken as a ground zero. Perhaps that to me may be of more significance than quantity, than trying to address every single possible drive. Yeah. They need to have the taste, the feeling of leisure, that there can be a state where you are calmly, unhurriedly looking into something. I think that's very...
so it's about balance.
Yes.
So you're saying, okay, so one has to find a balance. And on the one hand, you have the exams, the curriculum, the admin, the meetings, staff meetings and all that. And then, so what is then the balance with that kind of leisure that you talk about, right? How do you bring that about? Yeah.
I think, and that's where the teacher's understanding becomes critical. That the teacher needs to see that while the class, there are certain standards which have to be met, minimal levels of learning and so on. that it is necessary also to keep that space for questioning once in a while, to be able to grab that opportunity to really go into some question and to show that there is a rationale to it, there's a meaning to it. It brings about a certain lightness when you go into something to, and clarify. I feel it's I'm just using the word taste, that it's necessary for a child to taste that kind of a leisure, or that kind of an exploration which is unhurried.
I just, while you were speaking, I was suddenly thinking about another text where Krishnamurti, in discussion in Brockwood, who would say, "So how are you going to bring this about?" And the teacher also said, "Well, we have to talk to them." He said, "No, don't talk them to death." And then he said, "You have to create something within the school that they feel it when they come through the entrance." Right? There was the
My goodness,
yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, I don't know where that stands. I don't know how you relate to that statement, but.
Yes, I know that. It's a daunting standard. Yes, that they can feel the atmosphere, the quality of a place, even as they enter the gate of a school. But I think, we have to try to bring that about. Perhaps now that Krishnamurti has gone for some decades, we need to perhaps relook at our whole approach to education and reaffirm to ourselves what is the most important thing and see how we can bring that about. I would certainly say that for my own, for my own school, that we need to churn up things quite drastically.
Yeah, I have one more question. I just want to look
Yes,
at the
please.
time before. So at the last bit of the last part of the book, The Flame of Learning, of that chapter. So it's teacher coming off the pedestal, establishing right relationship, which means a relationship between freedom and responsibility. And then he goes to another two words which are surprisingly, if you have to weave them together in one logic sequence, he says it's then there's no motive, no self-centered activity, and then he qualifies that with psychological self-centeredness.
Right.
And then he continues a kind of feeling of responsibility for the whole. So I don't know if you would like to. I put it to you just to bring it out, and I'm happy also to help you with that. But I know it's quite a bit. Yeah,
it's another tough, tall order. And he says he brings in the metaphor of the submarine.
Yeah,
and how one needs to be not identified with a particular expertise that one may have, or a particular area of specialization, and be prepared, even if one doesn't actually do it, but be prepared to take on anything in the school. Now that's again, I think it's an area which can get ideologically taken as a formula, that everyone should do everything. It becomes like a rule. And I think we have to be wary of converting that into some kind of a requirement. Because then it also, if it is done with a spirit, in a voluntary spirit of learning, that's an entirely different thing from everyone being required to do everything. But yes, certainly it is part of the churning that we may have to do if we want to redefine ourselves, regrow in a certain way. it's all related to this, since he defined self-interest as it could be without the psychological component. For example, I may want the children to understand a particular subject well or a particular skill. That's also a motive. It may not have a psychological element in it. But the idea, I may try to create a group around myself, popularity based. Yes, so that's a very subtle point which one needs to concretely, consciously focus on in the discussions within a school, because this is a very subtle point which we perhaps don't often talk about. I don't think I have ever had a discussion about this particular matter in our school, that there is a difference between self-interest, which is between motive, which is not psychological, and a motive which is self-interest. And I think if there is that kind of involvement which is not always self-interest, then it perhaps naturally extends to concern for larger things. It is particularly relevant in a school which has a residential component, because you're there in the school all 24 hours, you're seeing the children at all times, and to have that kind of concern which is not compartmentalized, concern for the children, concern for the campus, concern for the cleanliness of the place. It's obviously a very strong demand, I think, because we shrink from it. Seems too much sometimes. We don't have the kind of energy to meet that kind of a demand. I would say it comes down a lot to our own capacities, our own ability to not bind ourselves, to not define ourselves, to meet situations without having this feeling that I am not cut out for this, but to meet it in a spirit of learning, a spirit of exploring something which you don't know anything about. So I think as teachers, we need to bring in that spirit into our discussions, into our relationship with each other to a much, much greater extent for such a spirit to come about. Otherwise, we very quickly get caught into our own little knot, my area of specialization, my area of expertise, and we form a little group around ourselves. I see that happening in all our schools. And to be able to not fall into that trap requires a great, very sharp, self-critical awareness, I think.
Would you say that when Krishnamurti started talking about education, which is already very early on, because Rishi Valley is maybe in the 30s already.
31, yeah.
31. That somehow a challenge has been thrown about a new or a different kind of education. And that the fact is that we don't really know how to do it. We know part. You know, and that it's still really almost like I know Krishnamurti doesn't like the word experiment, but that there's a kind of endeavor or quest, a quest or something for, with our humanity as it is, which is maybe self-centered, preoccupied, etc., to bring this about. That the challenge is, how do we bring this about? How does the actual individuals, the teachers and the staff who are in the school, how they actually bring about this change within themselves while educating the students. I mean, I see him. Krishnamurti often mentioned the term like the student and the teacher walk together or learn together Of course, the teacher knows about mathematics, but he is afraid. The student is afraid, and the teacher is afraid. So about fear, they can learn together. But that looks like a very simple thing, but that there's so much implied in that one statement of learning together about fear, which is something which we as humanity haven't worked out, right? So
I think we have not really experimented in that area very much. Because what we have not perhaps experienced for ourselves firsthand is how learning together in this psychological area, the kind of energy it brings to us. When you actually see something about yourself which you have not seen earlier, it brings a completely new kind of energy in you, which may give us the energy for further exploration. It can change your whole life, I would say, to really take the act of exploration more seriously and understand how it's paradoxical. By actually being more vulnerable, by opening oneself up in a way and examining one's assumptions, suddenly you stumble onto an energy which you never expected, which you never thought would be there, and it can change your whole way of looking at things. I think that is what is needed in our schools, and if only you have a body of teachers who experiment in that way and begin to see. Otherwise, energy, as we all normally experience it, is always around particular objectives. You're powerfully driven to accomplish one particular kind of task. It may be a worthwhile task also, but you're very driven hard in that direction because you want to accomplish that particular thing. And that's the energy that we experience, which is like an energy of desire, which comes about from a certain conviction. But this energy which comes about when you begin to actually see something truly for what it is a very different experience. And I feel it's desperately needed in our schools for more of us to touch that energy, which I think Krishnaji describes as energy without friction. To actually to be able to then understand ourselves further and go into things more deeply.
And when you say that, there are two things coming up. One thing is like a kind of visual, where on the one hand, each human being is, with all its fears, holding itself and defending itself and having all these, which costs a lot of energy. And you're saying, well, there's the opposite, which seems to be really contrary.
That's right.
Like, okay, if you drop the fight, more energy becomes available, so that the protection has a counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive, yes.
So, and when if I'm hearing you correctly, then you're saying actually, and that gives clues for the possibility for, of course, for humans in general, but also for what is possible within the schools. If you somehow can tap into that and make that possible, if we can create environments where that
absolutely
is support, where we support each other, that has a potential of doing much more than we maybe know. So you see that, yeah. There's one thing maybe which I just want to bring in because it somehow relates, although it sounds maybe unrelated, and that's where Krishnamurti uses the word communion. And I'm saying that because I have experienced, or I have seen, and I hear Krishnamurti also talking about it, that mostly we know when we are with other people it's my opinion versus your opinion, your beliefs, your internal world, my internal world. We're all separate people sitting here, all preoccupied with our own selves. But there are moments where a little light breaks through or something, where you have a sense that you're together on something.
Yes.
And that has also tremendous potential.
Energy. It has tremendous energy.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I would say that's a second clue,
Yes,
maybe,
yes.
for where this where humanity might be able to tap into in order to bring about this change. Yeah,
I think that's a great shift in paradigm, because our whole upbringing is, our experience of energy is only through the energy of desire and ambition. We desperately want something. And to even tap this kind of energy, which comes about through a shared seeing of something, it's it opens up your world in a very different way. We see something which perhaps we have never thought of was possible even. And I think that's what we need to explore much, much more in our schools.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jaap.